Well, thank you everyone for jumping in and listening to our inaugural episode of the Roll Wise podcast. I'm your host, Mike, and I'm here with my co host, Brent. Say hi, Brent.
Hi, everybody.
And today we are going to be jumping into one of our favorite topics in gaming, Dungeons and Dragons. And so I think that the reason why we wanted to start with Dungeons and Dragons is because I think there's very little argument to say that Dungeons and Dragons is the biggest game, the role playing game on the planet. There are so many people that play Dungeons and Dragons that it's absolutely insane. Many people think of it as like their gateway game. A lot of their friends entice them into the hobby by offering to teach them fifth edition or something like that. And when you look at those sites that offer any kind of statistics, you see that Dungeons and Dragons have the lion's share of the number of players playing on all the virtual tabletops and stuff like that. So we wanted to kind of just get this one out of the way early before we started to go into some niche games, because who knows, maybe this helps with the SEO and other people start to listen to this podcast because we mentioned D&D a couple times in the first couple episodes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Dungeons and Dragons is the one that's gonna land you on a list somewhere, as the game that everybody plays, and with Critical Role and
Adventure
other
Time and all that stuff.
Adventure Time and all that. It's definitely become the most popularized tabletop role playing game
So
in the world.
So unabashedly, we're going to kind of hopefully use D&D in the same way as we're going to start there as part of this journey, but we hope like many people that, start with D&D and go, well, maybe D&D is okay, but what else is out there? We can maybe leverage some of that to, get people to introduce to other games. Really kind of explore the hobby as a whole instead of just through the singular lens that D&D offers.
Well, yeah, because I think one of the things I would add to that is like the thing that people think about when D&D is your first introduction is that every game can be run through Dungeons
Mhm.
Dragons with a D20 rule set and mindset. And um, I think we both know that sometimes there's better games for a type of game that you want to run than trying to run your Wild West game in D D20 D&D. I mean, it's possible,
Mhm.
but it might be easier with something else. So that's kind of some of the lands that we hope to
Yeah,
traverse.
and it's also really crazy too because some people are so stuck to a system that they may try to shoehorn their setting into much frustration and effort and not really get the results that they're looking for. And I mean that's fine. I mean I personally can say I've tried to use Dungeons and Dragons to adventure in settings that weren't really built for it or try to tell a story that wasn't really best for it, and I've learned the hard way, but that's okay.
I think I think is any experienced GM will tell you that they thought running a game with a certain rule set was a good idea just to find out that that rule set seemed to be contrary
Mhm.
to kind of the aspects of the game that you were looking for. One of the things that I always contend, and I know some people disagree with me, so this could be the first hot take of the podcast, is that rules really support kind of build a framework for what the like tone and flavor of the game is going to be. And I think with the wrong set of rules, you can really flavor a game
Mhm.
awkwardly. Uh,
Yeah. And I think that not that an experienced GM can really flavor the game with a lot of different stuff, but I think what Brent might be hinting at is that in D&D, you like to swing swords. That's that might be an outcome that becomes more favorable than a lot of other outcomes.
there is the murder hobo. There is the murder hobo equivalent. There is the D&D players have a tendency to hammer and nail. If every problem's a nail, your solution's always a hammer sort
Yep.
of thing. But I also just mean if you're playing an investigative game per
Hmm.
se, something with a little bit more of an elaborate investigative rule set than D&D, where it's just like roll your
Hmm.
investigation. Oh, you got a 20, so you don't know anything about what you're investigating. It might not be the best fit per se. There might be games that have a little bit more flexibility for like just actual rules for like building an investigation that may not. And yes, you can go in and probably do the work and shoehorn that into whatever game that you're doing, even in D&D, but it might just be easier with a different
Yeah.
game set, or might be a little bit more in time tuned with the flavor that you're going
Yeah.
you're going
Well,
for.
and don't get me wrong. I think one thing that's very interesting is that D&D has also had settings and third party materials that have come in and tried to do some of that work for folk. But it it just there's sometimes there's and I think that some people might argue that the D20 system by itself has some inherent limitations just in how the mechanically it works. But that's not necessarily what we're going to go to in depth on this one. So I think we can kind of start with like what is D&D, and in case anybody hasn't heard of D&D and they somehow started on this podcast. um, I really feel like the search engine and the algorithm favored us for no other reason than just bad luck, because there are so many D&D people out there that are doing great YouTube channels, great podcasts. There are a ton of people that can speak to this so much more eloquently than we do, because I mean, while we love D&D, we love all games as well. So we have a wide breadth of stuff that we like to do. But in general,
And if we're your first choice for learning about D&D, I just want to say personally, I love you. Thank you for coming to our podcast, Brent.
yeah, we love that you're here. We don't want you to leave. Don't go to those other people. Obviously, stay here. We're just letting you know that we're just going to be giving a high level overview, whereas there are definitely people in there that have gotten into the nitty gritty. And that's not to say that we won't revisit D&D in later episodes. It's just not the pure. We're not going to live, breathe, and eat Dungeons and Dragons for every time we open up the mic and start recording. So. Okay, so what is Dungeons and Dragons? According to Wizards of the Coast, I quote: "In Dungeons and Dragons, the players form an adventuring party who explore fantasy worlds together as they embark on epic quests and level up in experience. The Dungeon Master, also known as the DM, is the game's referee and storyteller. There is no winning or losing in D&D, at least not in the conventional way. At its heart, D&D is a game that focuses on storytelling. The dice just help you along. Everything is your decision, from what you look like, how you act, and what happens next." So
Wait, wait, one question. Does it say that, at least not in the conventional way? Does like it say that, or did you add that?
hey, I just closed the quotes right now. That was on their website. So,
That's that's interesting to
what?
me.
Why is that interesting to you?
Uh at least not in the conventional way. Like I get. I mean, it's true. It's just a funny way to say, "Hey, your character may die." Really, is what it comes down to.
Well,
At least not in the conventional way. Your GM may make you sad for no reason. Then it's a good story.
I mean, that's true. I mean, but that's always the best story is when there's a chance at loss. I mean, I think you get a much more satisfying story for some people if the stakes are high enough that somebody could lose, or those really interesting sacrificial moments for a heroic sacrifice is always a good way to go too.
I agree. I just, sometimes wonder if those vagaries don't serve them a worse purpose than just being like, hey, sometimes stories might make you sad. There's no winning or losing in D&D, at least not in the conventional way.
Well,
Man, that just sounds like, man, that sounds like something selling you drugs would definitely say. You're not going to lose anything in the conventional way, anyway. It's
just
just, money and
materially, you're
time.
you're gonna lose big time, especially on D&D with its hundreds of, if not thousands of dollars in source material and all that stuff. But
Money and
spiritually, you will
time.
be a 100% a winner. That's
Yeah. Yeah. So it was just an interesting turn of phrase that they chose to put on their website.
yeah. Well, and so that's what they say, and I mean, I don't disagree with that, and I think that D&D is, when I think that they say that D&D is a game that focuses on storytelling. I I do take a small issue with that, because I think that if you look at, at its heart and at its origins, D&D was not a game that necessarily focused on storytelling. It focused on a premise in a dungeon. I mean,
Correct.
there's some part of it that, definitely when you're talking about dungeon delving and everything like that, I think at its heart it was actually more about focused on, going into the dungeon, fighting a big bad, saving the day, saving the kingdom and all that stuff. So there's definitely story,
Wait.
but I don't think it was as rich as maybe it has become in the last few years.
Well, no, I mean in like the first few editions of D&D before it was became like super popular,
Mhm.
that was definitely the goal. The goal was like like it was go in a dungeon, kill monsters and get
Mhm.
loot. And then like any character shit that happened like between that was like, nerd stuff. I think is originally how it was perceived, and then people decided that at the table, like, oh, your characters can talk to each other. Maybe that's more interesting than just stabbing things over and over
Yeah.
again. And I think that's where the game started to develop. But from that, I still feel like D&D is very much focused on the art of murder hoboing.
Because there's actually something very interesting. So, and I guess kind of in that same vein, because I think there's two things we could jump to from here, and one of them is like, what they actually put on the website for what is D&D. That's very flowery and all that stuff. But I mean, if I tried to tell somebody that and say like, "Hey, would you want to play D&D with me? This is what D&D is." I don't know necessarily that I would get their interest. So, I'm kind of curious, have you heard or do you have an elevator pitch for why, somebody who may not be familiar with D&D, I know that's getting more and more rare, why they should come to your table, join in and all that stuff? Cuz I have one that I found and I love it. It's absolutely my favorite.
Most of the people that I've ever played with have played some sort of role playing game before. It wasn't something where they're like, "Oh yeah, I've never played a game before. How about we play D and
Mhm.
D?" I do think usually, man, I would have a hard time pitching it to somebody. Usually, I feel like people I think the rare maybe one time that somebody asked me, like they asked me about it. They're like, "Hey, I heard you play D&D. Can I play in one of your games
Mhm.
sometimes?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And yeah, oh yeah, that was a friend of mine introduced me to another friend of his. Is like, yeah, you should come and play. It's just fun rolling dice. And I remember it was an interesting story because like he's only experience with anything related to role playing games was like
Mhm.
MMOs, and so like he started to describe pulling a mob like in an
Mhm.
MMO. Well, if I shoot one of them, can I drag them back to the party? And like we all kind of looked at him and we kind of had to stop and be like, yes, but in a way that isn't like a video game, and, like, we had to, like, get him to, like, stretch his wings a little bit, but my elevator pitch, so I was trying to talk somebody into playing D&D, that would be more what I would say is it's more just a fun storytelling
Mhm.
thing. Um, you hang out with your friends, you roll some dice, silly shit happens,
Yeah. And
and
depending on who you are, you might, if you're over the age of 21, you might add a few hoppy beers to the mix, and you might align a little bit more closely with the dwarf that you're playing. Who knows? Who knows?
exactly, like, I think that was always my elevator pitch, like, my always elevator pitch is, like, it's a fun game,
Hmm.
like, for me, it was all about, socializing, telling some funny stories regarding gnomes and dwarves and
Yeah,
stuff. Uh, I mean, serious games, but let the comedy kind of happen from
yeah.
there. So what was your story about your elevator
So
pitch?
so this one, I mean, it's so silly, but I mean, if anybody has anything that is even remotely fantasy leaning, so there's a guy, Dave Arneson. He worked with Gary Gygax to make all this stuff in the very beginning. But he basically said that, and I guess his pitch was, I have a game where Gandalf and Conan fight Dracula. I mean, dot dot dot, right? Like, do I get to be Gandalf or do I get to be Conan? Who knows?
Gandalf and Conan fight Dracula, which is funny that anybody would like because those are three very distinct pop pulpy game
Hmm.
feelings. And I don't necessarily if D&D captures any of them particularly
I'm not
well.
saying they,
Those specific individual. Well, no, I'm just saying it's funny. It's a funny way to.
yeah,
It's a funny way to. Again, it's a funny. But that is a good elevator pitch. That would make anybody interested in like anything nerdy. That would make
hmm,
definitely. It definitely would pique the ears. In that
yeah.
case.
And and who knows. I think that in those kind of things where people are like, um they're like, well, how do you get somebody interested in the game? I think you're right. um it's like somebody says, like it's, oh, it's a collaborative storytelling game. I think I think that is it's fun, but it's like, I think they already have to be interested in that. Whereas I think if you give them something ridiculous like to the Conan, Dracula, blah 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 blah, And I don't know. And I thought and in case anybody is like fact checking me, I think that was Dave Arneson, but I could be wrong. So we'll see. Uh,
Don't fact check us. That's my
yeah, don't fact
suggestion.
check us. This is way too hard.
Um, no, like I don't know. Like, I think somebody would have to express interest first. Like, I'm not the type of geek that's ever going to be
Hmm.
like, bringing my D&D book and seeing like who's looking at it and being like, hey, do you think maybe you're interested in a game? Like, I couldn't. I'm still the type of nerd who will spring it on people
Hmm.
later. Like, I'm still the type of nerd who will be like, oh yeah, I do play games in my hobby time. Like, it's not something that I advertise up
Hmm.
front.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I think that the second fork on that, where you talk about like story and all those kind of things, and definitely in the beginning there were story components to it, and I think and it was maybe not as well developed, because it was all based on more tactical wargaming and all that stuff. You go from like,
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning there wasn't a story. It was like, you're five guys and your job is to get through this
mhm,
dungeon. Here's puzzle number
yeah,
one. Like, there definitely wasn't, like, in the things that I've read in original like D&D before it was
hmm,
D&D. It definitely wasn't. There was like no character development. It was like, you're a knight and you might as well be
hmm,
mute and not have a tongue, because you're not going to talk to anybody. It's unless you're answering like the Sphinx's
hmm,
riddle in path number 3 of Dungeons of Infinite Dark Madness or something like that.
hmm, yeah. And I think that when you go back in time, what's really interesting is that the lore itself flourished tremendously under the second edition of AD&D. And when you think about AD&D, I think that's where like the sweet spot was for many, at least many legacy players. I think when you get back there, you start because in the first edition, everything like that of AD&D, they actually had they had the different settings and everything along those lines. But I really think it blossomed quite a bit because once you started getting all those boxes for the different, settings like Dark Sun, Forgotten Realms, I mean, they just added so much depth to each of these locations that it really gave people a kind of a living world to play in. And I thought that was cool. I know personally I liked having that level of detail to kind of get more like have maps and stuff like that, and kind of like continuity from one person to the next as to what was happening in Waterdeep for Forgotten Realms, or how Athos was laid out and all those kind of things. But you know I'm not sure necessarily that everybody shared my shared my love of all the different modules and everything like that were being put out.
No, I think people usually picked one or two that they really enjoyed.
Mhm.
And I think in D&D first edition, like, Greyhawk was really like it, because I think that was Gygax's baby. Like, that was his original gaming
Yeah.
world.
Um, I think
Um,
in addition to Greyhawk, they had Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, and something along the Oriental Adventures. Because also, I mean, and we could talk about controversies at another point in this podcast, but like, those were the four I think biggest ones.
was Forgotten Realms pre 85, like pre Gygax leaving?
Mm, I thought so. Uh,
No, it says in I'm sorry, I'm looking this up. In 1980, TSR released the resulting product, World of Greyhawk Folio. This was the first official campaign setting released for Dungeons and Dragons, and for several years was the only official setting for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So yeah, AD&D Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is when they started introducing Forgotten
oh
Realms.
yeah. Oh, I thought we were still
Um,
talking Forgotten Realms. My apologies.
yeah, no, yeah. So yeah, Greyhawk was originally the only
Hmm.
world, which is kind of interesting. No wonder people are crazy about it being, I don't know, right? I don't know. Um, but yeah, and then they introduced, I think, Forgotten Realms, and then after Forgotten Realms, it was like
Yeah.
Dragonlance, um, Ravenloft, Dark Sun.
Yeah. And I could. I mean, I thought the Forgotten Realms was part of the AD&D first edition, and then I mean it definitely had a huge like they expanded on what they had already put out in the first edition quite considerably, and then went absolutely bonkers with the number of different systems and everything like that when it came to second edition.
Well, yeah, the thing that made it Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is now probably should be called second
Hmm.
edition. The thing that made that like the thing was them like if they introduced a new place, like if they put out a new universe or a new setting, like they introduced new rules for it almost universally. Which is something that they I think in 3.5 and later editions they've gotten away from. Like they kind of want to stick to the core rulebook, but like if they introduced a new world, like there was new
Hmm.
stuff going to be in any of the any of the additional world books. Like in Dark Sun, um, which is one of my all-time favorite settings. Like in Dark Sun, when they initially released that, like all like the psionics rules were the big new thing for
Hmm.
that. Like that was the psionics rules are really for Dark Sun. Um, then there was they had been planning like a battle system. Like if you look in some of the later Dark Sun
Hmm.
books, they had been planning like a battle system where you actually had like large scale battles, and they were gonna have rules for like because they referred to the book, but the book never came out. But they had these like battle rules where it's like you were in charge of whole armies and things. Um, and that was towards later in Dark Sun. But that was the thing is like I think AD&D really they were still finding like what do we do to be what are things that we think are
Hmm.
important and what can we do. There's a lot of experimentation still going on at that time.
Yeah, and I think that with in addition to things like what they were doing with Dark Sun, I just felt like they were just pumping out so many more of these lore books, and I like I said, I personally enjoyed it. But what's weird is that one of my like I liked the lore from each of these different and like I liked Dark Sun, I liked all that, and I think that if you were to ask me like prior to Eberron, like what was your favorite system, I would have definitely loved Dragonlance, mostly because of the nostalgia. I don't think I've necessarily given Dragonlance the critical eye in the last few years that I probably should have. But when you're a kid growing up and you have the Dragonlance novels and everything like that, and that's kind of like leading you in the way to the Dragonlance setting. I really enjoyed just the Dragonlance sword sorcery setting that they had set up. Now, admittedly, they
Well,
are
I mean,
putting on a new Dragonlance thing, so I have either the opportunity to fall entirely in love with it again, or realize I didn't like it as much as I thought I did.
the what I don't remember what the trilogy's called, but like the autumn, summer, and winter
Yeah.
books, the original like three
Hmm.
books, like those were they're probably dated now, but those were really good books. Like and you could easily see playing a game about heroism because of
Hmm.
those books. So yeah, I could Dragonlance was never my favorite
Hmm.
setting. Just because I got into Dragonlance later. But the first setting that I ever played in um and really loved was Forgotten Realms. Like that was the first like of the pre-generated
Hmm.
worlds in the D&D universe that I was into. Drist and Elminster and all those. And then later when Dark Sun was introduced, that became my favorite just because it was so
Yeah.
non-Tolkien, and so different from everything else. I really, really loved it. Um, but Dragonlance was always interesting because it had a lot of interesting tropes in
Hmm.
it, um, like Kender and just the like how they split the red robes, white robes, and red robes, white robes,
Hmm.
and black robes was an interesting thing to me because it's again pretty different, but
Yeah.
um, they're all quality, like they're all really quality.
Hmm.
Like all of the worlds that they managed to build definitely had a separate personality and made them places you wanted to explore, in my
Oh,
opinion.
exactly. And I think, and that's what was really cool about it. And I think that, when you look back, like I said, that's why I think I so fondly look back on second edition AD&D so well, is because, I mean, it just opened up all these different things. And then of course, because it kind of gave you this clay to work with, I think me personally, and because obviously I had the most time back then, I really was able to create some very fun campaigns and have a lot of fun with these different worlds. And then I think also, there's probably a lot of books now. I just don't read as many, but when you're reading things like Chasm and Minotaur for Dragonlance, or you're reading some of the, Dritz novels, for Forgotten Realms. I mean, they just added a lot of depth to the place, and really it connected you a little bit deeper than I think you get with some of just
Well, yeah,
settings only.
and then sometimes when you're running the games, like when you're especially when you're younger and like it's pretty discovered, but like being able to run a game and then recognize things from like the book you read was always really, I don't know, it felt neat. It felt neat to
Mhm.
be like, oh, you see one of the members of the Harpers, or a Red Wizard of Thay, for all of you Forgotten Realms fans. And like you knew things about those from the world that you had read about, and that was really cool. And I think it was something that you could play with, especially when you're younger and running
Mhm.
games. That was one of the things that was really cool, is you could throw those people in there, like you know meeting Conan, like
Yeah.
you know especially when you're younger. I think later, as they got more defined, I think it becomes sort of a problem where it's like, what's left to discover, because the areas are pinned down. But that doesn't mean you can't have fun. It's just one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I know this place, we've been here.
Yeah. Well, and also and not to call out any kind of, rules lawyers or anything like that, but it's like if you make changes, because every one of those published books in some way is canon, and then somebody who may have an interest in DMing or may have purchased the box set to kind of immerse themselves in lore, that last thing you want to have is somebody at the table going, "Why I go to this place because this guy is here and I know that he can do this thing
Right.
for me."
Or that's not really in Waterdeep. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
basically, one of those things can really happen if there's if it's too if it's too fleshed out. But I mean, it's a risk that I think is okay to take, because I think it adds a lot of character to the world, and you don't necessarily need to go 100% all in on these kind of things, but if you at least can provide it enough life, I think it can add some interesting tools to your tool belt. So,
Yeah.
and so kind of we've talked a little bit about, I think, the different settings that kind of got introduced in second edition. And I think a comment that you made earlier about how the editions have kind of evolved over time is an interesting thing to see when you go into Dungeons and Dragons, because obviously Dungeons and Dragons being kind of like the OG role playing game. And in fact, I think it could be the original, like, kind of this is the catalyst for all role playing games out there, was Dungeons and Dragons. Is that correct? I mean, is that just like, because I only am aware
I
of
think
this
the
in English language, but in fact in another country they had something similar.
No, I think in the modern expression of role playing games being what they are now, being the storytelling
Hmm.
systems. I believe historically, yeah, D&D was really the first game to really push that sort of like, hey, you can tell a story with these rules. And I don't know, maybe if somebody's listening to this, they'll correct me, but I'm pretty sure that it was really kind of the first one of those, and everything kind of piggybacked off of
Yeah.
that. Because I think the role playing game, like with chainmail and stuff like that, way back in the beginning. And God, I'm old. With chainmail and stuff like that, those right in war games, and then evolving into like um the role playing we know today. I think D&D is really the first um people to
Yeah.
do it. And I really think that's kind of molded kind of where everything is, kind of where we are with the tabletop landscape now, as I think it's very influenced by D&D. One thing that I did want to ask you about really quick before we move on,
Hmm.
though, getting back to settings a little bit, did you know there was a second setting introduced with Eberron?
A second setting? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, there was another. So during the edition, which is
Uh-huh.
3.5, 3.3 and 3.5, they're talking about here, we're supposed to be two new campaign
Hmm.
settings, one of which was
Yep.
Eberron, and one was Ghostwalk.
Yeah, Ghostwalker. Because Eberron took all my money, I didn't do anything with Ghostwalker. And if I remember
I,
correctly,
for
this is
the
all.
life of me, don't remember Ghostwalk
Well,
at
it,
all.
it apparently didn't have the same. It didn't have the same impact I think as Eberron did. And I think if I remember correctly, both of those were introduced more as like fan submissions, which would made them very interesting. Is that I don't because I know Eberron was
No,
Eberron was a fan.
Eberron was the steampunkish
Hmm.
setting. Those who don't know, is steampunkish magic punk setting, and a winner of a large user submitted
Yeah.
campaign setting contest. But Ghostwalk apparently was just one that they rushed out prior to D&D 3.5. And as they say in this article that I'm reading, which was rushed out prior to 3.5 and not supported
Hmm.
thereafter. So I mean, I understand why I didn't hear about it, but it was just kind of funny to see, like, I mean, I buy a lot of role playing books, and it's kind of funny to see one where it's like, oh, I've never heard of Ghostwalk.
Yeah, like it's just weird because like I mean and I couldn't for the life of you, like I said, tell you anybody that I played with that actually did anything with it. But it was just one of those like Eberron was basically one of my like imaginary settings that I never took the time to write down, and I was like it would be really cool if it had X, what if it had like a train in it that was powered by magic, and what if it was like kind of super high magic, like I mean it's like one of those things where somebody had apparently like taken everything that I wanted in a setting and put it on paper. So I mean kudos to, I think it's Keith Baker, right, who wrote Eberron. Like I would give him a big hug if I could,
I think so, yeah.
because that was awesome for him to put all those things together. Because Eberron is my favorite setting since it came out. I haven't had any displacement from that top spot.
Well, yeah, I'm the same with Dark Sun.
Yeah.
Dark Sun will forever be, both for nostalgia and for creativity reasons. It will always be my favorite flavor of Dungeons and
Hmm.
Dragons.
Yeah. So, all right. So I think that the next part that I was going to kind of talk about, because you had kind of mentioned the different editions, is that since it went through different editions, it's interesting to see how Dungeons and Dragons really evolved. And to kind of get back on that, it kind of was, they took a war game and tried to put it to paper, and then it went from, a war game on paper to try to actually give it more structured rules to make it more of a role playing game. And this is kind of where you get to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But I think Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was still a huge mess. Like, I mean,
Uh, anybody who has ever had to calculate FATCO, uh, which is to hit armor class 0, if anybody has never heard of it, for you younger folks out there, anybody who's had to calculate that in their entire life, like that's where the rumor that like D&D players were all nerds, math nerds, was because of FATCO. Like, and it was a mess like that.
do you personally
Is
remember how to describe to somebody how to hit armor class 0 with the AD&D rules? Do you remember how that all worked?
Well, yeah, because what happened was, is your armor class, the better armor class was always negative, so you always subtracted it from the target number. So you always wanted to roll. So like the person would roll and they would add their skill and then subtract the armor class, right?
Well,
Or
you
would
would
you add
add
it?
the
I
armor
can't.
class, and so
Apparently no. Apparently no, I
see,
don't.
this is why I love THAC0, is because it was so ridiculous. I mean, because it was to hit armor class 0, so you'd roll a d20, and that was, to hit armor class 0 was you roll your 20, and then if they had a positive armor class, that made it easier to hit them, right? But if they had a negative armor class, that made it harder to hit them. So you'd add -3 to hit. And I mean, it wasn't easy to get into the negative armor classes until you were a higher level or had mini magic items or something like that. But it was definitely a lot more calculations than they needed, and it was definitely um how do I say, like it's definitely it was kind of a mucky part of
Well,
the
yeah.
game when you're rolling combat and stuff.
Well, okay, now I kind of remember. I don't remember. I looked it up, to be frankly honest. Me saying I just remember is a total lie. But no, Thatco. So your stat was to hit armor
Uh-huh.
class 0. So you had to roll you had to roll under your Thatco to hit
Yep.
armor class 0. So from there, you had to calculate how to hit an armor class less than
Hmm.
0,
Or greater than 0.
um,
Most often it
or
was greater
greater
than
than
0.
0. Right. So
Yeah,
yeah, so positive.
positive made.
So if they had a positive, if they had like a 6 AC, you subtracted it from your
Hmm.
THAT-CO. And if they had a negative AC, you added it to your
Yeah.
THAT-CO. So if they had a negative AC of like 6, you'd have to your THAT-CO would have been a 20. Yeah, it was not
Yeah.
easy. Like it was not it's not super intuitive. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was still one of those editions that had a lot of charts, um, a lot of reference material that you had to like look at.
Well, and like I think, and also like in the first edition of AD&D, maybe even the second edition, I thought in that one they also still had all kinds of really kind of janky rules about being certain classes, or if you were a certain class and you had a high enough, characteristic, and that was important to the class, you got experience bonuses. So it was just kind of messy overall, and I believe you couldn't multi-class in the traditional sense. You could only multi-class in classes that were allowable. Um,
Well, you had racial
mhm.
restrictions, which is something that will never be in a game again. You had racial restrictions, like in AD&D, no one but a human could be a paladin. Like there were no elven paladins or dwarven paladins. There were only human paladins. Like so, it had stuff like that, and then it had ability like qualifications. Like if you wanted to be a fighter, I think you had to like, have like a strength of 15. If you had less than that, you couldn't be a fighter. You had to be something
Well,
else.
and I thought
Um,
in the original one it was like, oh gosh, and like paladins had like the most rigorous, and I think that rolling the just to be a
well, yeah, because
paladin was
it had like
hard.
Well, yeah, because it had a strength requirement, a charisma requirement, and a wisdom requirement. I think because it needed all like those were your main stats for the thing, so you had to have all of
Hmm.
those as a in AD&D, and that's a little bit lighter than first edition D&D, because in first edition D&D it was like dwarves are dwarves, like you leveled up as a dwarf.
Yeah.
In original D&D, there were no like classes weren't for those special
Hmm.
races, like you were just a dwarf, and the abilities that you had were your dwarven
Yeah.
abilities, which was like helmet and hammer. And then in AD&D, it was like, well, we have classes, and then each race can be a class with
Yeah.
limitations. And then there was like, oh yeah, you could buy different abilities, and then there's percentage abilities. There's still percentile dice involved. So like some skills were percentile dice, where it's like you have a 20% chance to do this versus something else. So it was a messy edition. There was a lot of rules in it. The good thing about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is there's also a lot of it was a very permissive edition
Hmm.
though. Which I think is one of the keys to a good game is like there wasn't a whole lot of no in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There was like if you were like, well, I want to specialize in this thing, like you could make it work. It would probably work. And like if you were like, I want to be a barb roller who just hits people with chairs, like I don't want to have weapons. I just want to,
Hmm.
grab chairs and hit people with them. Like there's chances are in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons you could build a character that could do
Yeah.
that. Exclusively. It was a very permissive
Hmm.
edition. But one of the things was things that are really permissive like that is again it suffers from the problem of like what do I do with all of
Hmm.
this? Like, and I think that's where AD&D, that's where Dungeons and Dragons really benefited from moving to 3.5 from AD&D. Is they 3.5 managed to be permissive but restricted at the same time. They got a lot of um, value out of their restrictions that they decided to implement by streamlining some stuff.
Yeah. And in 3 and 3.5, they decided that they were going to more thoroughly embrace a simplified D20 mechanic, and I think that was
Mhm.
also a good idea because it was less crazy, and so when you're rolling to hit, you didn't have to calculate a THACO and all these other weird little things. You just basically said, here's my attack bonus, what's the armor class, okay, I can hit, yay or nay, kind of things. And I think that.
Right. Yeah, they did. I mean, they flipped it really, and is what they did. Like THACO, the real reason THACO is crazy is because there's negative numbers. Like if you just flip it the other way and flip the scale, like you can make THACO like this, but it requires a little bit of work, but not as much as you
Mhm.
think. Um, so they flipped it, and that was like genius because at the table now you don't have to do You don't have to get on your slide rule and abacus and figure out, carry the five, type of math to figure out how you're going to hit the dragon. Because another funny thing about the article I was reading about Thatco is it says not many things had an armor class lower than 0, which in my years of playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is a total lie.
Well, it always felt like it, didn't it? Because I mean, it didn't take it took a little bit to get under 0, but then there were, I think if I remember the monsters manuals, I don't recall there being a lot of creatures with that, but I think that as DMs, many people kind of like had to do that because player power in AD&D got really wonky.
Right. But I mean, but like any no, like I know a dragon was like -10, if I remember right. Like so there was a lot of those creatures that became like, famous Dungeons and Dragon creatures that were all like in the negatives. Like I don't think like I think a goblin had an armor class of 0.
Oh, did it? That
I think
that
so.
I wouldn't be able to say one way or the other. But
So like I feel like that's not true. But don't fact check me on that. I
yeah,
could be wrong.
don't fact
But
check
it's
this
just a funny
podcast. Really, I
memory.
think that's
It's
just for it.
I think that's the funniest part about like Fatco is like I remember everything being harder to hit than maybe it was, and maybe that's because I was bad at the game.
Well, I don't think it was bad. I think it just really what it was is just your penchant for rolling really poorly. Just kind of showed through, and you're like, it feels like everything has an armor class of 0 or or lower. Maybe that's what it
We're
was.
we're we're going there now. In the first episode, everybody gets to know that I have the worst dice luck in the world. Thanks, Monster, or thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I thought we had to start somewhere, right? And so let's go ahead, and I since we have the ability to fact check, I'm just trying to see, can we fact check ourselves in the same episode? Is that
That's what I've been
we're
doing.
fact checking ourselves? Okay, well, this isn't going to be a common thing because obviously we don't like fact checking yourself all the time is silly, but yeah.
I've just had a couple articles up on like Fatco that I was looking to see if I remembered how it actually worked. What are you fact checking?
I'm really curious to see if I can find if a goblin had a 0 armor class or not, because that would be hilarious. Like armor, oh, because I'm just curious. Oh, Jesus, how do you spell goblin? Do you spell that with a G?
Yes.
That
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition Wiki.
no goat. Oh, I might be close. Goblin armor class 6.
They had an armor class 6. Yep.
Yeah. So see, I think maybe your poor dice rolls might have been there.
That is
Eh,
possible. And they had to roll a 20 if you had an armor class of 0.
Yeah.
So,
So and obviously back in those days.
or I had a ton of mean GMs that were like, "Nah, these goblins are all really cool."
Well, you weren't playing with me back then, but I have a feeling that that might have been the case. They were like, because I don't know if this was a trope, but it always felt like, at least in the groups, it didn't really matter who I was seemed to be playing with. Anytime you went into like a tavern or a bar, it was always some adventurer, some grisly adventurer that had, retired from adventuring was running the bar, because if it wasn't, then if the players had any murder hobo-esque tendencies, they would go into the bar and then they would like just start fights for some reason. Like they're like, I just created this
Well,
character. I want to see how combat worthy it is, or something like that.
well, there's a few things you will always come up in Dungeons and Dragons games, in my
Mhm.
opinion. One is that is a trope, and I think that trope actually started in the Dragonlance books because I believe one of the super badass characters in the book actually owned a tavern between fights, and I think that
Mm.
happens in the novel. Is some guy starts some trouble and he just
Just
rolls over them. But the other trope that I think happens in every Dungeons and Dragons game is you're always going to have that thief that tries to steal someone's pants.
I,
Like I think it's always going to happen.
it might. And so I think what we can do is we'll probably leave the tropes for a little bit later, because I don't think are the tropes necessarily D&D specific. I don't think so. I think they're fantasy specific, but
Um, I don't know if I agree with you on that. I feel like more rogues in my games have tried to steal people's pants than in any other game I've ever
That's
played.
fair. That's fair. So continuing our tour of the different editions, I think 3 and 3.5, those editions are where I had my most playtime. I definitely was introduced in AD&D, and my first book that I ever purchased was actually the Complete Book of Dwarves. I do not know why I loved the dwarves so much, but there was this hobby store in Kalispell, Montana. Went in there, boop, they had it in this weird section because this hobby store was all about like embroidery sewings. Like imagine a Joanne's Fabrics type of place, and then there just happened to be like several D&D books like tucked away in a corner kind of thing. Uh,
Well, yeah, because it was a hobby
yeah,
store, and that's where you got your D&D books
yeah.
for some obscure
But
reason.
3.5 is where I played definitely the most. I had the most consistent gaming groups for Dungeons and Dragons at that point, and I mean, I wouldn't say that D&D was the only game in town in terms of games. It's just that happened to be what everybody was kind of agreed upon playing. Um, I really think that 3.5, that's I mean, I feel like it wasn't maybe the best, and some people call 3.5 like simulationist, but I don't. I mean, I feel like those people that call D&D 3.5 like simulationist maybe haven't played things like GURPS or Hero or something like that are really detailed games. Because I mean, it was simulationist sort of, but I don't know if it goes in so deep as maybe some of the other games do. What are your thoughts on 3.5 being kind of a simulationist phase
Um,
for it?
3 and 3.5 will always hold a near and dear place in my heart because again, kind of like you, that was where I got most of my gaming, like my formative gaming years. Those years where you have just enough responsibility to be busy, but not enough responsibility to not make a game. Um, that was in 3.5, and again, I really enjoyed the permissiveness of the system. Like I felt like there was a lot that you could do in
Hmm.
3.5 to customize characters and make them kind of your own. Um, yeah, no, I thought it was a really great addition, and I feel like it really set the tone for where the game should go. We could talk about 4 here in a bit. But 3.5, 3 and 3.5 really, I think, were like seminal editions of D&D. I don't think we would be here if not for 3 and 3.5. I don't think D&D would have ever become what it is without those kind of
Hmm.
influential games. Um, yeah. Um, they were really I mean some of my favorite games were in 3.5. You could do a lot with the characters. The feat system was really good. Um, it was still very miniature oriented, which made some of the like theater of the mind playing kind of difficult. Stuff with like attacks of opportunity and 5 foot move and stuff like that. You really kind of needed a board for it. Um, which I think was a limitation of the game for me back then. Um, but I think it was like I said, I think it was one of the most important additions. Um, I think it was I think it's the edition that got us here
Hmm.
where we are. I think fifth edition takes a lot from 3.5, and I think the future of D&D with kind of how they're talking about feats, which I know we'll talk about one D&D
Hmm.
later, but I think with how that looks like that they're going with more feats, getting one at first level and potentially thereafter, I think is kind of a harkening back to that.
Yeah. Well, and I probably agree with that. Like I don't like I think that 3.5 like people remember that stuff very fondly. I mean, there were definitely it had its own different problems because I mean, I think each edition has kind of been plagued with certain types of problems once you really start to get into it. And I think 3.5 really suffered a lot at higher levels because I think what was the phrase that I heard is like wizards were quadratic, fighters were linear kind of thing, where like all of a sudden your fighter is swinging their longsword, kind of charging it with sword and board, and then all of a sudden you have this wizard hurling fireballs, casting wish spells, like depending on how high power the campaign was, it just made it just didn't feel like there was equity after like level 10 or 11. Like that just felt like the
Well,
wizards
yeah,
kind of turned into their own tier, and unlike other editions where wizards had to earn it, like, and that's what was kind of interesting is like in earlier editions wizards had like some of the most aggressive like exp goals that they had to hit in order to level up. They had D4 hit points, so they were basically made of
Right.
paper mache, and you
Well, and
lived.
it was roll. It was in AD&D, and if it wasn't like if you didn't house rule it, it was like you roll for your hit
Yeah.
points. And so there was like you got that one, you rolled a one, so your wizard has one plus his constitution bonus and hit points, and it was like, oh, you don't have a constitution bonus because you're a
Yeah.
wizard, so you got one hit point at first
Well,
level.
yeah.
Good luck.
And I mean, it added some complexity to those low level games, but I mean, I feel traumatized because I did play a wizard that rolled one hit point, and I felt like
Well,
the DM just put me out of my misery because like I was like being super cautious, and they're like, "Well, that's interesting, a bee sting," and I was like, "You're gonna be that guy? Like what?"
Well, and I don't think like in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and even 3.0 or 3.0 and 3.5, I don't think like cantrips weren't just spammable abilities like they are now, are they? Like you only had a certain amount of cantrips you could cast in a day, wasn't it? Or they just didn't have attack cantrips. Like you could like I think one of the biggest problems in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, one of the bleedovers of 3.5 is yeah, wizards got really powerful later, but like they were super weak early because like they didn't have a lot they could do during combat. Like it was like there's my one first level combat spell that I have. Now I'm gonna shoot things with my sling and try and run away for the next however long this combat is, while the fighter would be in there doing their thing. So yeah, there was definitely a balance shift
Yeah,
later.
and I mean that's fine. I just feel like like it was one thing where they just got left so far behind, if that makes sense. Like, and I think that kind of that was what felt like they were trying to correct into fourth edition was that I and I definitely think you had more experience in fourth edition than I did. But like but basically they tried to rebalance things. They tried to use the whatever at will encounter daily whatever kind of abilities.
Yeah, at will encounter daily, and I think it was at will. Yeah, it was at will encounter and day. Yes, I think you're right. It was that was it. It was like
Mhm.
that. And then yeah, I think it was an attempt at rebalancing that stuff, but like it was done very poorly. Like I think a lot of people like fourth edition. In retrospect, like I know you hear a lot of people who are saying it wasn't as bad as we thought, but like I think that's partially nostalgia and partially not remembering actually playing the game. Like remember what I when I said about like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and third edition being permissive
Mhm.
games? Like that was and I we were talking about off podcast, we were talking about fourth edition. I was trying to remember what exactly rubbed me the wrong way about fourth edition. And that was what would rub me the wrong way about fourth edition the most. Is fourth edition wasn't never felt to me like a permissible edition. Like hit like that guy that I talked about, like if you made a character that wanted to hit people with chairs,
Mhm.
you know, like that was not something you could do in fourth edition
Yeah.
because you had an ability that you had to use if you wanted to do an attack.
Mhm.
And you used those abilities. It was more, and I always tell people it felt like there was a big change towards like kids are playing MMOs these days. Let's make Dungeons and Dragons more like MMOs. And so they gave everybody a first level ability that you could
Mhm.
spam, and then they gave you a once and then encounter ability, and then you gave you a once daily ability for tough encounters. And then tried to balance all around that, which really suffered from the problem that of everything just kind of became samey. Everything became
Mhm.
kind of like I always describe it as particle effects for those MMO peoples. It's like, oh, I use my ability and it has purple flames instead of green ones. And everything kind of just felt like that. It was like,
Yeah, and I think
um,
that one thing that was kind of different about it that I don't necessarily think was the fun. And honestly, fourth edition, we gave it a try. But at that point, we just went back to 3.5. My core group did, and the reason is because like I mean, I liked that they tried to simplify it. They tried to really say, okay, well let's kind of keep the rules simple, and then let's have the if the rules need to be broken, like the rule of cool definitely can um it can apply to this kind of stuff. So they didn't try to like over inundate you with too many rules and all that. But like we just kind of it just kind of became this weird like as the DM it seemed like you were more trying to like challenge them by getting them to exhaust their resources because a fully charged party, let's call it, people that had just they had all of their abilities charged, they could they could take on any similarly leveled encounter that you could throw at them, and I don't necessarily feel like that was hard. What became difficult was them to strategically have to be worn down between those milestones that were those rest periods or whatever it was, right?
Well, and I guess what I'm saying about fourth edition is like I don't think the rule of cool mattered at all.
Mhm,
Like in fourth edition, if you wanted to play a dual wielding fighter, for example, like you effectively couldn't because they didn't have an ability that let you attack with
mhm,
both weapons. And I believe the ranger who did, it really just did two weapon attacks that did less
mhm,
damage and acted just like the one
mhm.
attack.
And maybe that's not the
And so
right way
that's
to phrase it, like because like I said, rule of cool being just you don't want to get in the way of gameplay and stuff like that. But I think they tried to provide some exceptions to their own rules because they didn't have as many rules. If that makes sense.
I think they just in my opinion they had more rules and they really buckled it down to
Hmm.
being an enforced rules. Like there was a conscious decision of what type of game people were going to play in D&D 4th edition, and it was going to be we walk into a room, we do this encounter. We walk into another room, we do this encounter. We walk into this room, it's the boss encounter. So I use my daily, I use my once an encounter
Hmm.
ability. Now we have to rest. Like I feel like that was the game that was very strongly supported by 4th
Yeah.
edition. Um, to the exclusion of role playing to a degree because there wasn't very many like I don't even remember what the skill system was like in fourth edition. Like I don't even remember if it existed very much. It seemed like a separate game almost in comparison to the rest of the system. So
Like what do you
it
mean?
was
Just not having
like
skills, or?
there was skills, but they weren't used like you didn't I don't remember if you had anything like it like I'm sure you had intimidate and investigate
Hmm.
and all that stuff, but like the opportunities to use those weren't like they were very glad-handed in the book. Like I don't think they didn't come across as very important. And I remember one of the guys that was GMing at that time um was trying to figure out a way to use 3.5 rules for skills in 4th edition because it was very lackluster.
Hmm.
Skills seemed very much pinned on to this where this game is a combat
Hmm.
simulator sort of thing. And I think it just took a lot of the character game, a lot of the character of the game away. Um, is it good for what it does, which is room to room fantasy combat? I would say yeah, and you could balance the encounters pretty well because they were designed to be room to room encounters,
Hmm.
but I felt like that took kind of the heart away from. It felt very bland. It felt like it took a lot of the heart away of D&D
Yeah.
for
And
me.
I think that you probably weren't the only one that tried to match the combat of 4E to the skill set of maybe 3, because I mean I do remember a friend of ours, basically, when he was commenting on skill training, he was just like, what skills, like, there just wasn't the same nuance to the types of skills that you got.
Right. I think you got them. And this bleeds in the fifth a little too. Like I think this is one of my kind of complaints about fifth edition
Mhm,
too. But like if I remember 4E, it was like, yeah, you got your skills, and then you never touch them again. Like you never got an opportunity to level up. You never got an opportunity to do any of that. They were just kind of there. And then once in a while, maybe the GM would be like, okay, roll on your
mhm,
whatever, like climb skill. And I remember one instance where I had a character who was just really strong, and he's like, okay, roll your climb, and like he climbed up a wall in full plate mail because like the skills weren't designed to be the skills weren't designed very well. It was like, oh,
mhm.
you just do it,
You
basically. You just
just
you
do
just
it.
you just scale you just scale that wall like a spider monkey, and you're up on top of the ramparts while the rest of your group is in the courtyard in full plate. I was like, yes.
It's very
Um,
heroic
but it was
seeming. It's very
ridiculous.
heroic.
It was very ridiculous. It was very ridiculous. That was that Battle Rager character I told you, which I would say was another proof that fourth edition wasn't very well balanced because when they tried to deviate from the attack ability, encounter
Mhm,
ability, and daily, when they tried to vary from that and like add things to the attack abilities, like it quickly unbalanced the
Yeah.
game. Like the Battle Rager I told you, its spammable attack was if you hit somebody in melee, you add temporary hit points. And it's like, so I have damage reduction, hit points every turn if I'm hitting somebody.
Hmm.
Essentially, yes. Oh, well, that doesn't seem broken at all.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and you know, and like I said, I think that those different skills were both limiting and cumbersome in some ways. But I did think that they got some parts that they kind of helped people out, because I think that people that were maybe first time introduction to the fourth edition, because I do think that there are definitely those people, and I hate to kind of tie this in like to Doctor Who, but there's always like, you know, everyone's like, well, who's your doctor? And that's usually their favorite or their first introduced doctor. You know, and everyone has an edition, right? Everyone was introduced at a certain edition, and that has some, hopefully some fond memories for them and everything like that. And I think that the one thing I really did like from fourth edition, kind of going away from those, was just how they explained the, you know, combat and everything like that. Is that, you know, you had your different, like you had your strikers, your warlords or whatever it was, and those different roles. And I think that kind of using those, even in fifth edition, is a great way to kind of build a combat. And I think I've seen other people kind of take that forward, even though it was, you know, it was retired with fourth edition and they didn't carry it forward into fifth. I do think that it provided some interesting kind of like, you know, kind of background and thinking about how you can, you know, design encounters and stuff like that, so that, you know, you don't like necessarily make it too easy. Or if you like, cause and I remember reading an article about a guy who was like, I don't understand why people don't fear wolves at low level, you know, more, because, you know, wolves have the ability, if there's another wolf on the other side, they get, you know, advantage attack, you know, like all these different things. And it's like, you can really make these skirmishers something
I would
fearful, you know, like,
I would say it's because they haven't fought any. If you have a pack of wolves that are next to each other in fifth edition, like they will straight up murder
yeah.
you. But um, so this is this is the first disagreement we're going to have on our podcast. I hate the striker
Mm.
warlord tank definition that they put in fourth edition, and you reminded me of how much I hated that. And the reason I hated it is because once again, it kind of fell in that
Hmm.
MMO kind of category where it's like in fourth edition, you were never going to have a party of all
All the roles.
um you were never going to have a party of all say
Uh-huh.
bards or all wizards or something like that.
Hmm.
And I think that again, I think that makes the game flavorless and not great. Because like it removes some of that agency, it removes some of that
Hmm.
permissibility of yeah, play whatever you want. It's you will in fourth edition, you were going to sit around the table and you were going to have a person that said, well, I want to play
Hmm.
wizard. And then you're going to have another person that says, well, I want to play wizard. And then somebody's going to say you can't both play wizards because we only have four people and we need a tank.
Yeah. Is that, but is
And
that
it
for
just
fourth edition only, or do you, because like I do have to say that sometimes there's some consensus, especially if you know, create your characters together. I've been at tables where they've been like, okay, well, you know, why don't you guys decide who really is leaning towards playing the wizard more, and then
I I think from a role playing standpoint, people don't want to step on each other's
Mhm.
toes. And that's different than fourth edition, which basically said you're probably going to lose if you don't have each of these
Yeah.
classes. Fourth edition was designed that you needed a tank to be able to hit to because it had a
Hmm.
taunt. I just remembered that. Like you had like your World of Warcraft style taunt. You had your ability that was like you make other people attack you within a 5 foot radius.
Well, was it that they did
Like
that? I thought with fighters, like they did
yes,
that,
they
or if they didn't attack you, they had a problem. Is that?
no, they had to attack you. I think you're right. I think you're right. I think that was a mechanic on one of the abilities where if they didn't attack you, they had not disadvantage, but they got a like minus to their roll on hitting anyone
Hmm.
else. But I'm sure they had an ability that was like they have to attack you. Or if it wasn't that, then attacking anybody else was like so detrimental that there's no way that they wouldn't just attack the king. Um, and like and so that's that and I feel like again that takes away from the permissibility of
Mm,
the system. Like the minute that you say no, somebody has to play this class that they don't want to potentially want to play,
sure.
um you're in a situation where that makes it not fun for
Hmm.
me. um Like, whereas in the later games, or in earlier 3 and 3.5 and now 5, like, we can you and it might not always be optimal to have a party of all bards,
Feel like
but
that's a jab
you
at
can have
me.
fun with it. Well, no, it's not a jab at you. That game worked out. That game was fun and it worked for a
Yeah.
while. I guess it wasn't all bards. It was 3 bards and a monk. But uh, but no, what I hated in that game was the fact that I said, "Hey, I'm gonna play a bard. I don't ever play bards, so I'm gonna play a bard." And everybody was like, "Oh, we're gonna play bards too." And I was like, "I hate you." Because like that's not the point of this game. But anyways, thanks for stealing my specialness, everyone. Um, that was the problem with that game. But anyways, I digress. Um, uh, like you can do that, and like you as a GM can make the scenario fit the fact that you have this party of wizards that if somebody comes up and sneezes on them, they might die.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas in fourth edition, like it was like, no, if you don't have a tank, you are literally boned. Like you will not beat this encounter. Because we tried it. Like we tried a couple games where it's like, okay, we have, 2 sorcerers, a bard, and a
Mhm.
thief. Go. And it's like, oh, we're all dead. Yes, you're absolutely have all just been destroyed in this 2 rounds of combat.
Yeah.
Um, and like fourth edition just it had it just locked the game down too much, in my
Mhm.
opinion. The rules, instead of allowing creative play, which that's an argument that people have, right? Is like if you have tight combat rules, does it really eliminate the role playing? And I think sometimes it does, just because you become because it becomes a game that you play combat.
Yeah.
Like it becomes a game that's like this is a combat game.
Well, exactly, and I think that D&D has kind of always suffered from that. I mean, as much nostalgia and love as I have for D&D, I can't say it's the best gaming system out there. There's definitely systems that have done things better than D&D, but I think it's like D&D is like the comfort food. It's like the mac and cheese for me. I can always go back to D&D. I can always be I can usually be satisfied with the game kind of regardless, and especially in fifth edition I find that
Yeah,
that's I you know what, like if I'm trying to figure out something to run or something to play, and like everyone's kind of like hemming and hawing and they're like I don't know, and it's like oop, let's just do fifth edition and call it a day.
I guess if we're using franchise talk, one of the things I always tell people is like the reason that McDonald's and Wendy's and those places work is because when you go to, say, I go to, let's see, Florida, like Pensacola, Florida. If I go to Pensacola, Florida, and I go to McDonald's and I order a Big Mac, I know I'm going to get a Big Mac. I know it's going to be the same, pretty much the same Big Mac as I get in Montana. And I think D&D that is what D&D
Yeah.
does. D&D is the franchise. D&D is like if you play a D&D game, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get a D&D
Yeah.
game. Whereas some of the other games that we'll probably talk about in the future is if you're going to play that sort of game, it may not be the game that you think it is. I mean, you'll probably have
Mhm.
fun, but it just might not be, it might be more pulpy
Yeah.
or it might be more horror themed. Whereas D&D is usually going to be just you're going to get a D&D
Yeah.
game, which isn't
It's
which also isn't a sword and sorcery game. It's a pulpy fantasy
Yeah,
game.
well, and I admit that I think if you're playing the adventures, you definitely get a similar experience, and I think there's a lot of people that have played a lot of the modules out there, but at the same time, I think that um, the mechanics aren't too crazy, and I think this kind of leads into the fifth edition. Fifth edition, I think, has done really good. Its popularity is at an all-time high. It has got advocates in the gaming world like you wouldn't believe, and I think that from an introductory standpoint, I think the way that they've paced this system, it makes it super easy. I mean, admittedly, like you kind of discover that level 3 is when your classes actually kind of grow up and become adults, but like I mean, it's super easy to introduce people, and if you have people that have never played a game before, they can start off at level 1, and it doesn't beat them over the head with an incredibly large rule set. You can even buy the starter box. The starter box is thin down rules, and it's just easy to go. Okay, guys, let's go fight some dragons or whatever. I mean, I don't think you say that to a level 1, but at the same time, you can easily just pull it out, get a knight,
I mean, you
get a
can. but you're a mean
It's
GM.
true, it's true. But it's just like you can go on a Wednesday night, invite some folks over, and you can do something that can have a little to no commitment after that day, depending on how late you go in the evening, and then maybe the next Wednesday you do it. And if you happen to have like a board game group, I don't think it's too big of a leap for that group to go, okay, well you're taking me over from, my Euro style games to D&D, and now it's kind of a more infinitely changing game as opposed to how some board games play out. You can have different
Oh
strategies.
yeah, 100%. I really do feel like fifth edition is by far the easiest system to introduce people to, and I think that is why you see its proliferation in podcasts and YouTube and everything like that, is because
Mhm.
it is a game that, even if you don't know much, like if somebody decides to watch Critical Role or one of those games, like it's not hard to pick up on the rules even if you're not aware of
Mhm.
it by proxy from those other people.
Yeah.
Like if whoever's running the game says, okay, go ahead and roll your dice, and you see them roll a d20, like the mechanics of it are understandable from a purely like visible standpoint. Like
Mhm.
it's easily
Yeah.
explained, versus some games that aren't. And I think that's really the strength of D&D. Like I said, you're not going to go to McDonald's to get sushi. You're going to go to McDonald's to get your Big Mac. And I think, D&D is the Big Mac. Like it's the game that
Yeah. It's
is going to be pretty easy for everybody to swallow and cope
yeah.
with. That doesn't make it a bad game. It just makes it a game that might not be, I always say it's not a bad game. It's just a very middle game. Like it's a good game and it's the one that you can introduce people with. But is it a game that should be the only game you should play? My argument is always going to be
Yeah.
no.
It's true. And I think that, and I think that the one thing that's kind of interesting, and I think it's just so fresh in my mind, is that, even though D&D has been around for so long, I also think D&D, because it's kind of the biggest game in town, it does suffer from its own kind of controversies. And I think that, if you're okay with going into this a little bit, controversies have been really interesting. And I actually was reading, just kind of because apparently somebody has decided that Dungeons and Dragons controversies gets its own wiki page, where they just decided to like lay out controversies in chronological order. And I was like, oh,
Interesting.
that's kind of cool, and kind of weird, because I feel like, having lived through, my young early years as kind of like a closeted D&D player, because I didn't advertise that I played D&D. It's like you had that weird, like, oh, what do you do on the weekends? Oh, I play D&D. Or if you were in the comic book shop, then you kind of let down your guard, and you kind of said, oh yeah, I play D&D, or you play war games, or whatever you happen to play, or whatever it is.
Right. I believe the common response for me when they say, "Oh, well, what do you do for a hobby?" "Oh, I write and hang out with my friends." It's never, "I play Dungeons and
Yeah, it
Dragons."
definitely wasn't.
That is a very specific. There's a very specific people that I would say that to, and it is not usually. It is not something I'm
Advertised.
for my lead with. It's not something I lead with. Let me put it
Yeah,
that way.
it was definitely later into the whole, friendship, later into the friendship, that you were like, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just hanging out with some other people." "What are you guys doing?" "Reading books together," like,
For me, it was always, "What are all these books?" "Oh yeah, I play
yeah.
D&D."
And so I think that, when you talk about kind of early, the early controversies definitely were, like the whole whatever satanic panic and all that kind of stuff, and how things
Mhm.
definitely went crazy. But after it kind of got, and this is something I didn't know, and this is, because it was definitely an earlier part of this, but when they were publishing like AD&D, to kind of address those people that were kind of loudly complaining that D&D was all about Satan worshiping, or all kinds of unseelie type things. They actually renamed Devils and Demons to the Batzu and the Tanari. I didn't realize that's the reason why they had done that. I just thought that they
I didn't know
yeah,
that
I thought that
either.
was a kind of an interesting factoid, that, I mean, they literally, in order to kind of pander to those people that were, because there were people that, that like always saw that as being the victim. I feel like back in the day, because video games weren't really a thing, they were like, okay, well, let's take a look at this person, and they'd look, and they'd see in a corner like a D&D book, and be like, aha, that is the reason for their aberrant behavior. They were they were worshiping demons on the weekend or something like that. So,
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
mhm.
Yeah, like they basically changed the name so somebody couldn't open the book and go, "Oh, this has demons in it."
Exactly. Yeah, they renamed them to Betezu or Batazu or whatever you want to call them, and they were often referred to as fiends, but they were never apparently the devil. The D words, as they said in this article, were never uttered for years within the game, and even though fans may have still kind of referred to them by their original names and stuff like that, it kind of focused on like the extra dimensional aspect and how they started the blood war and all those kind of things. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense. That is
mhm.
interesting. I actually didn't know
Yeah,
that
and it
either.
wasn't until like way later did they actually start relaxing those restrictions. Not till like the end of the '90s when they started introducing books like A Paladin in Hell, I guess, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, it's pretty hard not to talk about that when you have a game like White Wolf,
Yeah.
or Vampire that came out and was getting popular, and they were like, I mean, the first edition of Vampire was basically, "Oh yeah, by the way, God
Hmm.
exists and he hates you."
Yeah, and I think Montana.
So it's that probably would lead to a more relaxed standard of that.
Yeah, and again, I think it definitely is some of that out pandering to outrage kind of thing that always happens, and obviously it worked, because the people that were outraged, and I think that like video games, I maybe I haven't seen it, but I don't think anybody has proven, with any kind of study that people that jump into role playing games or anything like that have more suicidal tendencies, or you know what I'm saying? Like I feel like role playing games tend to fill a certain niche that helps people deal with kind of complicated issues, right? I mean, I admit that
No,
I'm not a
100%.
psychologist, but I feel like some of the things that some of the reasons why people go down these dark paths or get really violent and all that stuff could be because they don't have a solid support group. And D&D, my D&D groups have always been solid support groups. So if I have a tough day, I can always talk to the D&D group about it before we start, going into our adventure
Well,
and
and
stuff.
also yeah, there's always the, you have a group
Mhm,
of friends, which is always good. And then, you have this outlet um for some of the, maybe if you have some subversive thoughts or whatever, you can get them out on
mhm,
the gaming table, and whatnot, in a safe environment with your friends. And then the other thing that I think is a big part of D&D and stuff like
mhm,
that is like you do have a reading component. Like you are going to have to read some books and stuff like
mhm,
that. And I think I've always been of the opinion that as long as somebody is reading, they're bettering themselves, even if it's something that people don't think
mhm,
is necessarily the best. Like reading anything is always better than not reading at
mhm.
all. Um, and it engages your imagination, which I think is, I think for a while was kind of a lost
Yeah.
art for the mid demographic of teens, till later in
Mhm,
life. So, and I think that's one of the big I mean, I've always been a big proponent of games as being, um it's sort of how I built my social culture, being somebody who doesn't drink or anything like
mhm.
that. Like it was a big part of my life because it was a good excuse to get together with friends and hang out and do silly fun stuff and not, go to
Yeah.
parties.
Well, that's true. It's
So
true. And so, but obviously D&D didn't stop their controversies there. And I think that the recent controversy related to like the Hadozi and stuff like that really kind of highlighted something that they've been grappling with, a long time, and that's the depiction of race in their fantasy games. And what I think is crazy is that, I mean, a lot of this seems to be based on like kind of a D&D originally was based on a lot of like Tolkien-esque, um, kind of Tolkien-esque kind of things. And it's when you go back, and I actually looked this up a little bit to see if I could find any like overtly, um, like this is blatantly like J.R.R. Tolkien is a racist or something like that. And it really didn't seem like there's a lot of evidence that shows that. Kind of looking at kind of the controversies, Wikipedia always being, you should always source Wikipedia because they obviously have 100% accurate information. But there was nothing, no wikis, no articles that I could find that really showed him being like that. So it's kind of interesting that over time people have used like this, this modern look to say like, oh, this is obviously what it is, and I don't think it's necessarily as clear cut to say those kind of things. And I think the Hadozi was kind of an interesting. It was interesting in so much as that this thing occurred, and this is a company that I think has put itself on it's put itself on a trajectory to really kind of embody diversity, sensitivity, and all of those kind of things. And yet still, even after all saying all of those things, it basically comes through and they say, well, we've got this thing that there is, if you want to interpret this uncharitably, you very well can see all of these racially insensitive like, I mean, it's like it doesn't take a huge leap in logic to kind of go, oh, well, I could see that this is poor depictions, prior racist history and all of those kind of things, right? And so I guess in your mind, what do you kind of think, how does somebody like, D&D and all that kind of stuff? I mean, it's like I feel like every gaming table is different, and I've never been in a gaming table where it's like turned into like, oh, orcs, playing an orc is racist, or like boiling down these races to only a couple different attributes is, you know, essentialist or whatever it is. Like, I don't feel like that ever comes up in my games. I feel like other people, if that comes up in other games, I've just never experienced it.
Well, no, but growing up in Montana, we're pretty,
Hmm.
white. So I can't say, and I don't think there's a lot of racial insensitivity, but it doesn't. I mean, fortunately, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't sound out to me that, you know, that doesn't stand out to me. Like the controversy with the Hadozi. Um, it's interesting, and I guess I can see how you get there, but
Hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of jockeying to get there. Like there's a lot of reading into it, and I have a hard time thinking it was intentional by the author, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, which I think intention is important. Like I think intention is important. Like if he wrote it to be, intentionally um unsympathetic or any of those things, I think that would be one thing, but I think it was probably more, hey, this is kind of a cool
Hmm.
backstory. Um and then other people are like, oh, that's terrible. Um I just I don't know. I want it to be inclusive. I want everybody to have a chance to enjoy the game. And you know, all of these things, anything sort of kind of fantasy is like, there's a lot of self projection in it.
Hmm.
But I haven't heard anything about Tolkien definitely being a racist as opposed to some other
Hmm.
authors, or having problems with race as some other authors. So, but I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, it's very interesting to me, and I'm no one who, I can't talk about it very well because I am a typify, middle class white American
Hmm.
male. Um, so I'm afraid that there are things that I don't see that maybe I should.
Hmm.
Um, that isn't necessarily, I can see how I can see how it'd be insensitive, but I also think it's important to share stories sometimes that have a part of insensitivity, because that's how we're reminded by that's how we're reminded that it exists and it's bad.
Yeah.
Um, like one of the things that I was talking about is like it scares me because like we talked about earlier, Dark Sun is one of my
Hmm.
um favorite settings in all of the any D&G franchise.
Hmm.
And it has there's a lot of history of slavery in Dark Sun. Like it's like an economy in Dark
Hmm.
Sun. And because that's one of the things that makes like Tyr heroic in Dark Sun, is because they are a liberated
Hmm.
state. That was the first story, is they liberated the slaves. And I think because it's depicted so poorly, like the people that have slaves in Dark Sun are bad
Yeah.
people. And I think that's important. I think that's the important distinction, is like I said, it's intent. If somebody was saying it's a good
Hmm.
thing, like that would be really bad. Like that should never be put in any sort of fiction whatsoever. It should be depicted negatively, and I feel like that's what these games do.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like that's what Dark Sun did specifically. And I would never play in a game where I remember I've been running a Fading Suns game, and they have one of the classes in
Hmm.
or one of the career paths in Fading Suns is actually you can play um, a member of one of the space guilds that take slaves, and I was just like, we're not having that in the game ever.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's bad. Like I don't feel like that should ever be like a player option.
It
Um,
it seems I mean, I guess it seems like one of those things where and don't get me wrong, I think that there's a point where you can use a redemptive approach. And I feel like it's definitely easier to have people that are on the good heroic side of things rather than the villain side of things. And regardless of the system that you play. Because I think that, if you like in that case where you had the Fading Suns where you can play like a member of this guild that has slavers. I mean, you could like I feel like that could be an interesting role playing it could be an interesting role playing situation that you have to go through. I mean, you're part of this guild. Do you agree with what the guild does in regards to slaves, or do you?
no, I mean that was the
Yeah, that's my
job.
point. Is
The
that
job was you. It wasn't you're a member of the guild that does this. It was you are. Your job is to
mm,
go out and get slaves. Like
exactly?
that's the job, and I don't think. And I think being a member of the
Hmm.
guild is one thing, but being like that being your profession and where your skills are all centered around, like that's too negative of a
It's I
connotation for
think,
me.
and maybe I misunderstood because I haven't played Fading, because I think and that might be a little bit hardcore. But if you were part of the guild, I could see like an interesting character dichotomy that you have is that you don't believe in these things, you're trying to change them away from it. Whatever it is, right? Like I
Right.
think that could be there.
Yeah, I can
But
see that.
just like, well, what do you do? Oh, I'm a slaver. Like that's a tough introduction. To party
Right.
cohesion. Like, why
Uh,
why would they be in any party? But then again, I think that there's a lot of people that could say like, well, just because it's a slavery type, just because it's a slaver type job, like, well, what makes the rogue okay? Like, are they all Robin Hood, Heart of Gold types, or like, I mean, there's unsavory things that they do. It's just not unsavory slavery, right? So I think there's.
well, historical connotations like in games
Mhm.
matter. And I guess that's where the thing with the what are they called? The
The Hadozi.
Hadozi comes in is like there's a historical context for what potentially happened to
Hmm.
them. And so I guess that's the thing is like I don't know, it's that thing, right? It's like if your rogue assassinates people, like that's just something you accept about the character class, but if if they are a slave taker, they're evil. Um and I guess that's I don't know, that's a I don't know how to slice that. I don't know how to slice that
Yeah.
really. But that's something in our culture like fighting and killing horror movies, action movies, like that's always been accepted more than taking away somebody's liberty, I
Hmm.
guess. And I think that's, partially due to historical
Yeah.
connotations. Um, I guess it's, I don't know. That is a good question. But yes, most rogues are fairly unsavory murder hobos.
Well,
That's
it's
what
just,
I'm gonna
and that's,
say.
and I think that's where it becomes really tricky because truthfully, like, I mean, I think that as any good session and anything like that, in D&D, regardless, you should kind of make sure your players are aware of the kind of world and characters that they are engaging in, and you may find that you have a group that is okay being the unsavory types. I mean, taking kind of an anti-hero trope, and going with it. You know what I'm saying? Like, they may appreciate that to some degree, but I do think you're right that
I would,
there's a line
man,
that.
there would have to be a lot of like table conversation, like
Mhm.
pre-conversation for me. I would have a hard time with a villain game. Like I always one of the games that was proposed to me once in one of my groups was, and I don't know if for our listeners, Warhammer 40K. There's a role playing game, and we'll probably talk about that in the future. But in one of the games that came out, Dark Heresy, they had a subset of books where you could play Chaos Space Marines. Um, and like somebody's like, well, let's play a Chaos Warband game, and I was like, no, because like the idea is there's a lot of revulsion in that, and I couldn't run a game like that
Yeah.
personally. Um, and yeah, I couldn't run a game like that personally because there is no redemptive arc for those characters. It is just
Just
Um,
wanton destruction.
wandering around in the basest human place, and I kind of don't think. I guess I play games, even horror games, where horrible things are going to happen.
Hmm.
I play more for a redemptive arc than
That's
that.
fair. That's fair. And okay, and so just if anybody's listening at this point and they haven't just tried to cancel us outright, it. I don't think what the point of this is not to say that we agree that people shouldn't be outraged and all that kind of stuff. I think just my only takeaway from the recent Hadozi controversy is that people sure, I feel like the greatest people that like put this and say like, oh, this is entirely racist. Yeah, sure, that's how you interpret it. There's always going to be that argument that you're going to write something and you can't predict how everybody is going to interpret it. And I really feel like it could be detrimental to always try to make your game so safe that there's never going to be the outrage crowd. And I feel like if that's the direction that Wizards of the Coast goes, I think they're going to end up with something fairly bland and unpositive. And there was actually, I read somewhere that Paizo, I think they were going to take out slavery. I haven't played any Pathfinder or anything like that, but I think they were just going to like say going forward, we're just not going to use that in any story arcs or anything like that. And I mean, that's fine. It's just that it's like, I mean, it's just one of those things where it's like, could you instead use this in ways that are creative and compelling and interesting for your world rather than necessarily just say we're not going to do it? And I don't know if like
I mean,
that's a thing, but just to kind of close out my thought on the Hadozi, I think it was just more necessarily lazy writing than
well, right. Exactly. It's a
yeah.
trope. Like, it's definitely a trope. But I think one of the things, I guess my whole worry about it is, one, I always worry about this, and this is kind of a personal worry, and God, I hope I don't offend anybody, because that's really not my intention. But my worry about anything like this is, if you remove all of these things that we see as hyper negative,
Mhm,
like Dark Sun and its economy reliant on slavery to a degree. If you rule if you remove all of that as is being negative, like, I think it's just something that is important to learn
mhm.
from. Like, people need to know, and unfortunately we're in a situation where, and this is way more in depth than we need to be, so I hope no one hates me on our first episode, um like, unfortunately in the United States, like, we talk about it, but it's never talked about a lot.
Mhm.
And I think putting it in a fictional realm like Dark Sun or something like that, where this is a thing and it's bad, and you need heroes to help combat this badness. And you should be those
Mhm.
heroes. I think that's a good message. Like, I think that's I think that's a good message, and I think that's the message that people I would like to think in my games that people focus
Yeah,
on. Um, not that it's a quick way to make a buck or whatever.
exactly.
Um, like, profiting on human misery is something that human beings are good
Mhm,
at, and I feel like the more stories we have where we illustrate how negative that
mhm.
um is important, I
Yeah,
think. um Especially in a fictional safe environment where no one's actually getting hurt.
exactly. Yeah.
um and that's why, and I honestly, that's one of the reasons why I think Dark Sun is kind of important too, is because it's a very ugly thing that they handled in the Prism Pentad. If people haven't read it, and you think you like Dark Sun, everybody should read
Mhm,
it, because I feel it's a collection of books. But, like, that's the thing, is they freed Tyr, and I that's a heroic thing, and that's really what everybody should do for everyone who has oppressed rights and civil rights and problems. Is everybody should be fighting for those people for their situations to be
but
better.
not necessarily with
Um,
swords and sorcery, like, you know.
Whatever you have to do, man. Whatever you have to do.
Uh, I feel like
Um,
in today's environment, I'm going to say that if you are fighting for those rights, contact your congressperson. Don't pick up the I don't even like the long sword and go, okay, well, Brent said.
there's your there's your disclaimer. Oh God, don't use Brent said as a justification for anything ever.
It's
Anyone who knows me personally, anybody who knows me professionally, anybody who knows me from this podcast, that should never be your train of thought. You should check with actual adults before you think that my thought is what you should go with.
So that's that. I think we can wrap up there. And I think, like I said, I hope that all this, hope this Dozy thing, because first of all, I hope that people weren't actually harmed by reading the character description of the Hadozi. I mean, I don't think that's what happened. Although when you go on Twitter, like people speak in such like absolutes. I read one tweet that was like
Right,
it was unconscionable. I'm like, wow. Like, I mean,
right,
like this is just a fictional thing. And I mean, I unconscionable is like what's happening to like the Uyghurs in China. Like that's unconscionable. Like
right,
these guys having a lazy
right,
storyline for the Hadozi is
right.
bothersome.
Well, one thing I will add, that I will add before we wrap up, and is I do think the one thing that is insulting about race in D&D is racial alignments.
Oh,
Like I think racial alignments are bad. Just because
you're talking like Drow being mostly evil, or
like all drow being chaotic evil,
mhm.
period. Like that's a stretch for me. Like and I've always, and like it's one of those rules that even since I was younger, like it always made me vaguely uncomfortable, because it's like if you look at any group of people, you can define them in general, but like just saying that, and it wasn't just that they said that they're all like it wasn't just that said like they're all evil. It's that you're supposed to assume that when you encounter them, they're
Mhm.
evil, and that's how it was kind of written, and that I have a problem
Yeah.
with. Like they could say societally, like the monarchs of Menzoberranzan believe in chaos and are essentially evil. I think the alignments. I mean, we could talk about this as a whole episode too. The alignment in D&D is
Well,
rough.
yeah.
I think in the modern age, the alignment system, like, um, just saying someone's bad is not okay.
Well, I
Um,
think the tough
you
part
know,
is that they and this I think this kind of gets into game design and stuff like that. Is that one of the complaint that is always kind of is kind of just persisted with D&D is that they take inspiration from real world type things, but then they don't play proper homage to those things. And I think like the Drow, for example, I mean, I think you could get really detailed with the Drow, and I think that they did a good job creating a culture and society that was very alien and cutthroat to how we think it is. But to your point,
mhm,
it basically meant that if you were on the surface and you saw a Drow, you had to assume that they were there to grab slaves
right,
or
or
kill
kill
you.
you.
Like there
Yeah,
was no
yeah,
reason like you would see a drow outside of the Underdark other than for those reasons. And I think even, like into the
right.
abyss, I think that's like isn't that what happens? Like you just start because they like a drow slaving like caravan come and
Yeah, like,
took you the adventurers
yeah, that's the thing.
down to the Underdark.
And like, and it's rough me saying that, because like the reason Drist is so good in like the books is because he's a complete anomaly in the society that he was born to. But I think what you need, but I think what needs to be called out is, in like, there are good drow. It's just that, like, the societal culture isn't necessarily, good. I mean, it's bad. But like, I don't know, it's a weird corner they've kind of backed themselves into, I think, with alignment.
Yeah.
Like, like, man, like, saying a whole society is evil, and yeah, and kill on sight, and they're basically kill on sight. Like that's a rough sell for anyone. Um like and I guess this is kind of the fantasy aspect that's a problem in D&D, or maybe this is the simplification that's kind of like the thing, is like in the modern world it's hard to say, like, I've never seen a group of people and I go, yep, those people, chaotic evil. Like, so it's really hard to like shoehorn that into my head, that even happening in like a fantasy
Hmm.
setting. Um so, and I think that's something that D&D, if they really want to be forward thinking, they should probably, man, D&D without an alignment system would be weird, but I really think it's grown past needing an alignment
Yeah,
system.
and you're probably right to some degree. So I think at this point we probably could wrap up.
Have, have beat 12 dead
We
horses on the
if
that.
anyone's still listening, either they have the longest commute ever, or they just had no idea where we were meandering through on this journey. And who knows? Maybe they liked where they went. Maybe you know what? Maybe this is going to generate a lot of rage, and we don't want you to be
It's
mad,
just about
but
I was just about to say they listened long enough to tell us how much they hate us on
Yeah,
Twitter.
or even
Uh,
worse, there was like some transcription bot that transcribed this and then told people on Twitter to be mad about us or something like that. That would be
yeah, yeah,
that would be
something
worse.
that would be bad.
But
Please don't
yeah,
do that. Again, if you're listening because you're enjoying our discussion, I love you. Um,
we, we
so thank you
we
for
definitely
listening
love you.
so
So
far.
I guess, and we don't really have I guess any final thoughts about D and D you wanted to share? Because I mean, for me, I would say that if anybody wants to play D&D, I would say go for it. If you've never played D&D, play it just so you can have the experience. That D&D has got a great community. You can usually find D&D players at local game stores. You can go online. You can use the Roll20 matchmaking system that they have. Reddit has threads where you can look for group, and you can do that for all games. But I mean, D&D is pretty easy. Usually, you can find people that are running groups that'll take you either virtually or in person, and it is
Or just take you.
just take you. Yeah, they put a black bag on your head, and I think we're starting another problem here. Like, but but
Just
but you
kidding.
can get into it even if you don't have something as formal as that. You can get into things like the organized play. You can get into like adventurers league. So there's just a lot of opportunities to really get into D&D, and I think that really, we didn't have a ton of people that did this, so we kind of found our own passion with it. But I think now there are so many people that are passionate about the game, it almost rubs off on you. Like they love it so much that you almost kind of love it too, I guess. But do you have any final thoughts, Brent? Play D&D, no play D&D?
I would say play it. Take the opportunity. Try it. Have some fun with your friends. Roll some
Mhm.
dice. The worst thing that'll happen is you'll have a stupid story about your elf falling down and stabbing themselves in the leg or something. Um, most of the time you're gonna find people just trying to have a good time, tell some stories, and I think D&D is a good vehicle for that. It's just not. It has its problems, but everything does. But the thing to remember is, what's better than playing pretend with a group of your friends?
Exactly.
And that's really the ideal of every game.
Yeah.
So,
So I guess with that, we appreciate all of you that have taken the time to listen to this in part or in full. And those of you that have only listened to part of this, then I guess you're not going to hear the appreciation because we're not going to do it every 10 minutes. But we do really, really appreciate you. We hope that you'll,
unless that's what you want. If you want in future podcasts, you want appreciation every 10 minutes, we'll work on it.
if we can try to bring that to the table. So with that, we thank you guys for listening. We hope you roll well and roll wise. And I think do you want to scene us out, Brent?
And scene.
And scene.